I'm Doreen Binder, President of the League of Women Voters of Portland, and we'd like to welcome you to our Voter Education Forum. Sorry, this is... the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that works to help citizens make informed choices in our elections. We do not endorse any candidate or political party, but rather, we give voters the information they need to select a candidate. Membership information is available on our website and in the table at the back of the room. We appreciate the support from MetroEast Community Media, Paloma Clothing, the Multnomah Bar Foundation, the Wise Foundation, and the Carol and Velma Sailing Foundation. Plus, we'd like to thank Multnomah County government for the use of this room. If you have not yet registered to vote, the last day to do so will be October 16th. You can contact your county elections office, or you can register online with the Oregon Secretary of State. Ballots will be mailed out beginning on October 17th. Tonight we will be having a panel discussion between the Portland City Commissioner's race, and we'll also be discussing two ballot measures, Measure 103 on groceries and a Portland Measure 2301 on clean energy. Thank you.
We move now to the forum on Oregon Measure 103, which prohibits taxes and fees for groceries. This session will last approximately 30 minutes. I am your moderator, Linda Mather. Please remember that MetroEast Community Media alone is authorized to record this forum. Audience members may not use any type of image or sound recording device during the forum. Now, the next part I have to read has a lot of commas, so bear with this. Measure 103 would add a new Section 16 to the Oregon Constitution, prohibiting the state or any local government from adopting, approving, or enacting any tax, fee, or other assessment on any transaction for the sale, purchase, distribution, or transfer of groceries, or for the privilege of selling or distributing groceries. Specifically, the measure prohibits taxes, fees, and assessments on the purchase or sale of raw or processed food or beverage intended for human consumption at all stages, including agricultural crops and food and beverage products of all types, whether in warehouses, transit, packaging and processing plants, restaurants, or other locations. We have two speakers with us this evening for civil discourse on this topic. One, Carlos, is from the Oregon Center for Public Policy, and Joe is with the Northwest Grocery Association. He is on behalf of yes on Measure 103, and Juan Carlos is no. We will do the same format that we had used before, except in this case, the speakers have asked for a 3-minute opening statement. So, Joe, you're going to get us started with the first opening, please.
Thank you, Linda. I appreciate that. Thank you all for being here this evening.
Put the red button.
Is it on now? Nope.
Well, that's the same one we had trouble with before.
Lights on. Hello?
I think it's...
Anyone out there?
Yeah, that sounds better.
Is that better? I'll just lean forward. How's that?
There you go.
Okay. Thank you again for coming out here now that you can hear me. I'm here on behalf of the Yes, Keep Our Groceries Tax-Free Measure 103. We brought the measure to the public really out of frustration over the last 8 to 10 years of tax policy. That's why we're here tonight. And we brought it to the ballot box for that very reason, to try to push forward the tax reform debate in Salem and around the state, and to make sure that people's groceries in this debate are held tax-free. It's often said that everything's a good tax as long as it's taxed on someone else. I want to tax someone with income, maybe I don't have income. I want to tax somebody with property because I may not have property. This is a tax we could all agree on that at the very basic core, it is very narrowly written. There's a lot of commas in there because of all the challenges that we've had in the legislature and other areas in trying to get tax reform. But it's very narrow. It exempts any raw or processed food for human consumption from taxes on the sales of those products from farm to fork. That's what the measure does. It does not include marijuana, it does not include alcohol, and it does not include tobacco. Those are all excluded. They have their own tax bases, and whether or not you want to argue whether they're basic needs or not, I'll leave that to you. But that is clearly what the measure does, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions on the measure, why we took this approach, and why we brought it before you, the voters.
Juan Carlos?
Thank you all for being here this evening. When assessing Measure 103, you would do well to follow the advice given during the Watergate investigation. Follow the money. Nearly all of the millions of dollars being spent by the supporters of Measure 103 is coming from just 3 of the nation's biggest corporations, Costco, Albertsons, and Kroger's. And these big corporations aren't spending their big bucks because they care about your pocketbooks. It's because they care about their profits. Measure 103 is about preemptively shielding the grocery industry and its biggest corporations from any new taxes they can well afford to pay. Revenue that we could be using here in Oregon to better fund our schools, address healthcare coverage, and address the housing crisis. Worse still, the measure would lock in this preferential tax treatment for the grocery industry in our Constitution. Now, the proponents claim that this is an effort to protect consumers from taxes on their groceries, but no one is proposing to tax food. The Oregon Center for Public Policy has been fighting against regressive tax proposals for over 20 years. If someone were trying to tax food, we would be out there in the front lines fighting against it. But there is no such effort. Now, there are a number of specific problems with Measure 103, but I'm going to highlight 3 of them. First, the measure is risky and flawed. So, for example, the language of the measure is broad enough to give a tax exemption to companies that transfer and distribute food. In other words, the trucking companies. Second, the measure takes away local control. The measure applies not just to the state government, but to local governments. Some local governments have considered enacting a tax on sugary beverages to fight the obesity epidemic. A reasonable option. 2 Oregon communities, Yachats and Ashland, have chosen to enact a tax on restaurant meals in order to fund important public services. Measure 103 would prevent any other cities in our state from doing the same, despite what their residents may think is reasonable. Third, Measure 103 will make it harder to fix Oregon's corporate income tax system. Oregon's corporate income tax system has been shrinking over the years. And in order for us to better fund education and other essential services, we need to make corporations pay their fair share. It's that simple. But under the measure, at least 3 of the nation's biggest corporations, Fortune 500 companies, will be exempt from any changes to Oregon's corporate minimum tax. And it is a bare minimum tax. Again, remember that Measure 103 is a constitutional amendment, so all of these problematic features will be effectively locked in. In conclusion, Measure 103 is an unnecessary, risky measure whose real purpose is to shield 3 big corporations from any further responsibility for the common good. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
And Juan Carlos, you'll get the first one.
All right.
Measure 103 would be retroactive to October 2017. What taxes already on the books would be affected by 103? How much revenue would be affected each year?
Well, the measure, because of the retroactive nature of it to October 2017, threatens to affect the ballot measure enacted by voters in January 2018. Just earlier this year, an overwhelming majority of Oregonians voted for the healthcare provided taxes to keep the Oregon health plan going. Because of the way the measure is written, it applies to processed foods. In other words, restaurant meals, prepared meals. And hospitals provide meals, and it's part of the revenue that it generates. So there's the very legitimate concern that Measure 103 will affect that revenue package put together by Oregon lawmakers and approved by Oregon voters. In other words, it threatens healthcare coverage in our state. In terms of...
No, you have more time, sorry.
And in terms of how much money it brings in, it doesn't affect it because no one's trying to tax food people. No one. So it doesn't affect revenue right now, except for that potential provision.
Thank you. Sorry. Joe?
In the last 8 years, our opponents have gone to the ballot for tax policy over 33 times, either to put a measure on the ballot or to ballot shop for titles with the intent of putting it on the ballot. The last 6 times have included sales taxes on groceries. After measure, which ultimately resulted in Measure 97 from the last election. Measure 97 was defeated, and in April of this year, the son of Measure 97 was put on the ballot, including taxes on groceries. The legislature also introduced several bills and heard several bills that included taxes on groceries. Something happened back in 2010. The legislative process, after 30 years of trying to get tax reform, broke down, and our opponents started using the ballot box. That is where the discussion of tax policy has now moved. The measure that we have before us, the retroactivity issue, actually, the Department of Justice has already commented on that it does not affect the hospital tax that was passed in January.
Okay, thank you. Audience, again, please feel free to send in any questions you'd like on some file cards. And if you need help, just raise your hand. There's one over there. Okay, Joe, you'll get us started on this one. Measure 103 would prohibit any new or increased taxes on groceries. What entities have been proposing taxing groceries in Oregon?
It would prohibit taxes on the sales of grocery. It would not prohibit taxes on the income or profit on groceries. So that's a very big distinction. Measure 97, brought on by our opponents, the list that is there, was a hidden sales tax called a gross receipts tax or a privilege tax from farm to fork. So it was a 2.5% tax on everything. When you sell the cucumbers to the processing plant, it's 2.5%. When you make the pickles and you sell those to the distributor, those are 2.5%. When they sell out to retail, there's 2.5% on that. And when the retailer sells to the consumer, there's 2.5% on that. It was combined, depending on how many people touch it, it's anywhere from a 5% to 8% sales tax on your groceries. And that is regressive tax. So this threat is here, it's here now, and it hasn't stopped. So we want to take the issue of food out of this mix of tax discussions, and we have to get at the issue of income tax, including corporate income tax, and our fair share.
Juan Carlos?
So we supported, the Oregon Center for Public Policy supported Measure 97. It was not a tax that was going to be assessed at the cash register, but rather a tax that was going to be paid by corporations once they file their tax returns. There's plenty of good reasons in research supporting the fact that it's a tax on corporations that ultimately mostly borne by the shareholders. It's not going to be paid by the consumers. But ultimately, that's really beside the point. I mean, because we need to talk about not Measure 97, but Measure 103. That's the one that's at issue. And whether you support it or oppose Measure 97, you have plenty of good reasons to oppose Measure 103 because it's a dangerous constitutional provisions that creates a big tax exemption for big corporations. There's opponents of Measure 97 have come out against Measure 103, like Nike, the Oregonian, the Portland Tribune, many others. So you really, you can have opposed Measure 97, and you still have a good reason to oppose Measure 103.
Thank you. And Juan Carlos, start us with, Oregon's personal income tax is a progressive tax because it takes a larger share of income from higher income people than from lower income people. A regressive tax does the opposite, taking a larger share of smaller incomes. In what way is 103 a progressive or a regressive tax?
Well, there is no tax at issue other than on the table, other than a tax exemption for some of the nation's biggest corporations. To that extent, to the extent, for example, that the measure were to exempt Albertsons or Kroger's from any increase to the corporate minimum tax, it would be a regressive tax. It would be a regressive tax exemption. Corporate taxes are, by and large, paid by shareholders. And it is that reason why this proposal is being floated. Follow the money. That tells you everything you need to know about who is behind this measure and what the real purpose of it is. It is to shield big corporations from any further responsibility towards the common good. And so to the extent that it exempts corporations from taxes, it's a regressive tax proposal.
Thank you. Joe?
Thank you, Linda. It's just absolutely the opposite of everything Juan said. Our measure actually has a clause in there to make sure that you know that it does not affect what we pay in income tax on our profits on grocery. Don't be fooled by the corporate tax, minimum tax argument. The corporate minimum tax only is for companies who don't make a profit. If you make a profit, you pay an income tax. So for a company who loses money in a year, they pay the basic minimum. For the poker players in the room, it's like paying an ante to be in the game. And this measure does not change that. The same corporate minimum tax will be in existence the day after this passes as it is today. We're trying to prevent a regressive tax in the discussion of tax reform, and that is the tax on food. Putting sales tax on food is never the answer to the tax reform issue, and that's where we found consensus. There is a reason this isn't a prohibition on sales on everything that we sell. We aren't taking out brooms, we aren't taking out soap, we aren't taking out other things we sell, just food.
Joe, start us with, you have stated it may affect hospitals. Will it also affect school lunches? Please explain.
It will not affect hospitals nor school lunches, nor trucking companies that, on their transportation, or fuel taxes, all made, arguments made by our opponents. The reason why is specifically in the measure, it only affects companies that are licensed and inspected by the Oregon Department of Agriculture or inspected by the FDA's commodity program. The FDA's commodity program inspects farms, so grain, corn, beef, those types of things that are coming off the farm. The ODA inspection is the inspection where they process food. So whether you're a bottler or you're a frozen food manufacturer or you're making cookies, you're licensed and inspected. Only those companies are included. Any company that's not on that list does not get the exemption. Hospitals, school cafeterias, cafes are not on the list. They aren't licensed and inspected, so they're not under the measure. And that list is available at the Oregon Department of Agriculture if you want to look through the business list names.
Okay, thank you. Let's see.
It's my...
I know. Thank you. Go.
So the language of the measure is very clear. It applies to the distribution or transfer of groceries to entities that sell groceries. So it does apply, on its plain face, it applies to trucking companies. There's also concerns that, I haven't heard the schools yet, but that's a possibility. Hospitals, it's another possibility that folks have highlighted. It potentially affects the bottle bill. Ultimately, we don't need to decide what the legal ramifications are here, but simply to point out that there's a bunch of unexploded bombs out there. I've been doing tax policy for over 10 years now, and one thing is clear, and that is that corporations and special interests have armies of lawyers and accountants to find tax loopholes. And this language is very broad, and that's the reason why, like, the Oregonian has come out against it, and the Portland Tribune saying it's unwise and unnecessary to put a constitutional change that is so risky and overly broad.
Juan Carlos, could sugary drinks or e-cigarettes be taxed if Measure 103 passes? What are the advantages or disadvantages of taxing drinks and e-cigarettes?
I don't know about e-cigarettes, but the language of the provision is pretty clear to me that it would ban taxes on sugary drinks. And that's one of the things about this that it's so objectionable, that it takes away local power, the decision of communities to decide what is in their best interest in terms of the health of their communities. We don't have a position on taxes on sugary beverages, but it's not, but I would definitely not take away that power from communities to decide. It's an entirely reasonable decision to say that Coca-Cola and Pepsi should not get a constitutional protection here in Oregon, that they should get a tax exemption. It's for communities to decide, and Measure 103 would take away that power from local communities.
Joe?
I would just reiterate, we don't believe that the taxation of people's food and beverage is the answer to any issue that government might bring up. We think it's wrong to tax people's basic needs. It's not for us to tell you what your basic needs are. What you put in your shopping cart is what you put in your shopping cart. That's why we defined it as any beverage, whether it's soda or any food, processed or raw, maybe celery, depends what you put in there, is free from taxation. And no regressive taxes on people's foods. Struggling families, struggling seniors, other people on fixed incomes, veteran family who struggle to put food on the table, their food should not be taxed for the problems that we do face in the state and then we do face locally. We're saying that's just the focus of this measure is very, very narrow. Constitutional amendment's an interesting one. The reason we're doing constitutionally, our Constitution has been amended over 240 times since our inception. Our whole system is just set up to have the Constitution as a living document. And even Measure 102, supported by our opponents, is a constitutional amendment. So you got to get left or right on that issue.
Okay, this is a little bit long, so bear with me. Joe, you're going to start us. Measure 103 would prohibit new or increased taxes on groceries, including grocery stores and warehouses. If the legislature approved an increase in the corporate minimum tax to fund schools, could every store start selling candy bars and every warehouse start storing at least one case of food, thereby failing to pay this tax increase?
No, that would be, you'd have to be licensed and inspected by the Oregon Department of Agriculture. And by putting a case of food of any kind in a warehouse does not qualify you for that. You'd have to go down and get licensed to show that you are actually a food company. So there's no way around just kind of showing up as a counterfeit company in the measure.
Juan Carlos?
I think it's an excellent question. I think it goes to the ways that this measure can be gamed. And again, corporations and special interests are quite good at finding and exploiting those loopholes. Now, what's clear, and we've talked about this, is that corporations that transfer food, like trucking companies, on its face of it, would be exempt. One thing that I want to go back to that was that I didn't address before is, look, Oregonians have shot down general sales taxes 9 times. The 10th time is unlikely to be the charm. Oregonians simply do not support it, and this is an unnecessary measure.
And this is also a complicated measure. I'm going to take a point of personal privilege here. May I ask each of you, before we get to the closing statements, to maybe expand your potential closing statements, but we've thrown out a lot of issues here in terms of the corporate tax, the Constitution, et cetera. How about a minute to tell the audience about some stuff that we haven't kind of massaged enough? Anything you want to go into more depth on in terms of what we've talked about so far? You got to think fast. Sorry, Joe.
Well, thank you, Linda. I heard a lot of suppositions by my opponent here on the left. Brought up the bottle bill, brought up fuel taxes, brought up the hospitals, brought up, it's all camouflage. There's simply one difference between where I sit and where Juan sits. Those who want to tax groceries and want to keep that alive and keep filing measures at the ballot box and keep filing more initiatives, which they have over and over 6 times in the last 4 years, to tax groceries, and those who want to say, hands off people's groceries, hands off their food, you're going to make prices go up, you're going to hurt people on fixed income, you're going to hurt people who are trying to put food on the table. Let's talk about all the other issues in tax reform.
Juan Carlos?
Just for the record, visit our website and you'll see what we stand for. We are very clear on being against regressive taxes and have been for 20 years. But the issue that I want to highlight is this. Here in Oregon, we're facing a lot of needs. Our schools are chronically underfunded. We have a severe statewide housing crisis, and our lawmakers have done very little to invest in them. We need to find revenue to address these problems that are affecting Oregonians. And this measure is basically a roadblock. It's a power play by 3 big corporations to shield themselves from any further responsibility. That's the goal, and made worse by the fact that it is a constitutional amendment. Joe says that, oh, well, the Oregon Constitution contains all kinds of junk. But once you put it in there, it's really hard to get it out of there. So, and worse when it's a loosely drafted one that will create all kinds of unintended consequences.
All right, I threw you guys a curveball there, but technically you still have a closing statement. Juan Carlos, you want to take it?
Sure. Well, thank you all for being here this evening, and thank you, Joe, very much for participating. With Measure 103, 3 of the nation's very biggest corporations are making a power play. They're trying to get not just a special tax advantage, but a constitutionally protected tax advantage. This would come at a time when Oregon is trying to figure out a way forward to better fund our schools and our statewide housing crisis. Measure 103 would create an obstacle towards resolving these problems. A no on Measure 103 is a no to a corporate power grab. A no on Measure 103 is a no to 3 big corporations changing Oregon's constitution to their advantage. A no on Measure 103 is a no to special interests coming into our state and taking away local control over community finances and community health issues. This November, you can protect Oregonians by voting no on Measure 103. Thank you.
And Joe.
Our campaign, yes, keep your groceries tax-free, is really quite self-explanatory right in the title. This is about keeping people's basic needs, basic food, anything that you eat or drink, tax-free and out of this discussion. We have lots of issues in Oregon. We have lots of issues locally. But taxing your groceries and having an aggressive tax on food, we've never had one in Oregon. But the assault is on. It has been going on for the last 8 years. Over 33 times they've been at the ballot box trying to go through tax policy. The last 6 have included sales taxes on groceries from farm to fork, just so you wouldn't see it. So we're not here because we don't have anything better to do or where it's a greedy grab. We're here because it's bad tax policy and we don't think that we should be making food more expensive in this climate. And we got to get people at the table. That includes the governor, that includes the legislature, on real tax reform, but not at the expense of people's dinner tables or putting food on their table for their kids to go to school. It's just the wrong thing to do. Vote yes on Measure 103. We thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for your flexibility. Thanks also to MetroEast Community Media for recording, for all of you in the audience, for the volunteers collecting the questions and timing. Please check our website, lwvpdx.org, to view all our forums and for TV replay information. For more election information, pick up our nonpartisan voters guide, which is also at the back of the room for you here, but for those of you watching on TV at your local public library, New Seasons Market, or Meals on Wheels Dining Center. For the similar information, go to vote411.org. Election Day is November 6th. As in all Oregon elections, you will receive a mail-in ballot if you do not check with your County Board of Elections to make sure that your registration is accurate. Ballots must be mailed early or delivered to an official drop-off site anywhere in Oregon no later than 8 p.m. on Tuesday, November 6th. The postmark itself does not count. Thank you for watching. Be informed, as you are, by doing all this work. And you can see how complex this issue is from the information that the gentleman has given us. Remember, your vote is very important. Help your friends, neighbors, and family vote. And we'll now take a short break after we thank our panelists.